This week on Jerusalem Dateline, we take an in-depth look at the foreign policy achievements of U.S. President Barack Obama. Is the world a safer place after 8 years in office? Plus, we look at what happens after the offensive to liberate Mosul, Iraq's second largest city from ISIS. It may surprise you. And a historic archaeological discovery reveals more about the ancient ties between the Jewish people and Jerusalem. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. In just a few months, U.S. President Barack Obama will leave office. His signature domestic accomplishment, his health care plan known as Obamacare, is collapsing. But what about his foreign policy legacy? As Gary Lane shows us in this in-depth report, many critics warn the president will leave the world in worse shape than when he found it.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
Moments after he was sworn in as the nation's 44th president, Barack Obama unveiled his foreign policy vision.
Our security emanates from the justness of our cause, the force of our example, the tempering qualities of humility and restraint. America must play its role in ushering in a new era of peace.
9 months later, the Nobel Committee awarded him the Peace Prize, not for his accomplishments, but for what he intended to do on the world stage. And now, as Mr. Obama prepares to leave the White House, some security experts are questioning his foreign policy accomplishments and the consequences of his actions.
Supporters of the president's policies say he's leaving behind a more peaceful world, and eventually the Middle East will be a safer place. But as critics here on Capitol Hill say, nothing could be further from the truth. He's created a big mess for the next president.
Fred Fleitz is a former CIA analyst.
He received a prize for a naive worldview that we know in 2016 has been an utter failure.
During his first inaugural address, the president said he'd take steps to end America's wars.
We will begin to responsibly leave Iraq to its people and forge a hard-earned peace in Afghanistan.
But despite that promise, peace didn't come to Afghanistan. The president wanted to withdraw all U.S. forces by late 2014. But instead, a resurgent Taliban wreaked havoc on the country. So Obama had to reverse course. Today, more than 8,000 Americans still remain there. In Iraq, the president withdrew all American troops by the end of 2011, despite being warned repeatedly by top government officials and military advisors, including his own Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, about the potential consequences. But Democratic vice presidential candidate Tim Kaine says the president had no choice.
Iraq didn't want our troops to stay, and they wouldn't give us the protection for our troops.
But Panetta has written in his book that although an agreement was difficult, it could have been done. And critics, including GOP vice presidential candidate Mike Pence, say Obama's premature withdrawal from Iraq helped lead to the rise of the deadly Islamic terrorist group ISIS.
The sacrifices the American soldier made were squandered in Iraq because this administration created a vacuum in which ISIS was able to grow.
And once ISIS was on the scene after Obama's withdrawal from Iraq, it carried out a horrible genocide against Christians, Yazidis, and others in Iraq and Syria, causing a humanitarian crisis in the Middle East and Europe.
You don't walk away from a war when the other team is bringing it to you. That is, I've heard this president say he wants to get out of these wars, but when they bring it to you, you have no choice but to lead and to protect the American people.
Congressman Mike Pompeo is a member of the House Intelligence Committee.
He told us that al-Qaeda was on the run. He has since told us that the ISIS was the JV. This administration has consistently refused to take seriously the threat.
Not only abroad, but here at home, say Pompeo and others. When Omar Mateen murdered 49 Americans in Orlando earlier this year, President Obama refused to call it an act of Islamic terror.
There's no magic to the phrase radical Islam. It's a political talking point. It's not a strategy.
When we have a president who will not admit that we are at war with radical Islam, who won't even use the term, when we portray this threat as some threat from an isolated terrorist group and not a global ideology at war with modern society and Western civilization, we're never going to beat it.
In Syria, critics say feckless U.S. support of moderate rebel groups caused al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, and the Islamic State to grow in power and influence. President Obama said he would draw a red line in the sand. if Syrian President Assad used chemical weapons against his own people. Assad turned over 1,300 tons of the weapons, but later used a chemical weapon, chlorine gas, against the rebels. Obama took no military action. As a result, Russian President Vladimir Putin stepped up his country's involvement, sending aircraft and troops to help Assad. Republican vice presidential candidate Mike Pence says weak American leadership in the Middle East led to Russia's return to the region.
There's an old proverb that says the Russian bear never dies, it just hibernates.
That bear came out of hibernation 7 years after the Obama administration promised a reset of relations with Russia. And Putin moved not only in Syria, but also in Georgia, Crimea, and Ukraine.
We watched the Russians take 1/5 of a sovereign nation, and America's response was almost nothing. That tells Vladimir Putin he has a green light, and you've seen him use that power.
In Egypt, Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood took office as president in the summer of 2012. But within months, he had issued a decree that basically gave him unlimited powers. His opponents called it an Islamic coup. Egyptians took to the streets in protest. President Obama demanded the Egyptian army restore Morsi and the Brotherhood to power. Some Egyptians claimed Brotherhood agents and sympathizers in the U.S. government influenced policy. Mohammed El Biari served on the president's Department of Homeland Security Advisory Council. El Biari had praised a Muslim Brotherhood leader and spoke at a 2004 event honoring Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini. And the president of the Islamic Society of North America, a group with suspected ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, advised President Obama on immigration and counterterrorism policy.
It is a good deal.
Barack Obama would likely say his greatest foreign policy achievement was the nuclear deal with Iran. But many critics say the administration only accomplished the deal by keeping key parts of it secret.
In the fall of 2016, we have a nuclear deal that can only be described as an enormous fraud. The only way this deal got through is because the details of it were concealed from Congress.
Congressman Pompeo exposed several secret side deals in the agreement.
This president struck a secret deal with the Ayatollah that's really between him and the Ayatollah. It's not even signed by either party. And that will almost always end in a way that does not serve the American people's interests.
In the recent vice presidential debate, Tim Kaine said the Iran deal eliminated Iran's nuclear weapons program. President Bill Clinton's CIA director, James Woolsey, disagrees.
I think it's worse than worthless. I think it may well be the worst international agreement the United States has ever signed. I think it will enhance Iran's ability to move quickly to have a nuclear weapon and not slow it down.
The reason is Iran can continue to enrich uranium, develop advanced centrifuges, and will have a reactor that produces plutonium that is being redesigned by the Chinese and will not be monitored by a process set up by this treaty.
Woolsey is concerned about the cash payments the Obama administration delivered to Iran the same day American prisoners were released in Tehran, ultimately amounting to $150 billion.
We are turning over tens of billions of dollars to them, saying that we're getting away from sanctions. In part, it seems it's more likely that what that is a bribery, essentially, to the Iranians to release some of our people they have grabbed.
Pompeo and others believe the money provided by the U.S. may be used by Iran to spread terrorism and further develop its nuclear weapons program.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
So nearly 8 years after his swearing in, America's Nobel Peace Prize winning president has fallen short of his goal of ushering in a new era of peace, with many analysts warning that the world is now a more dangerous place than when he entered the White House.
The president thought when he came to office, his magnificence and his aura would solve all the world's problems. The fact is, these enemies of the United States hate us regardless of who's in the White House. They hate our way of life, they hate our country, and they didn't change the way they thought because Barack Obama became president.
And they're likely to pose greater danger for the world and the next American president. Gary Lane, CBN News, Washington.
Up next, hear what one Middle East expert warns could happen after the military campaign to liberate Mosul. Welcome back to Jerusalem Dateline. The campaign to retake Mosul, Iraq's second largest city, has begun. It represents a milestone in the campaign to defeat ISIS in northern Iraq. But as Middle East expert Jonathan Spire warns, it also represents a new and perhaps more dangerous time in the Middle East, something he calls a war over the ruins. Jonathan, you just came back from Kurdistan. What are the dangers that you see when ISIS is defeated, perhaps in a few months or a few years?
Well, look, here's the thing. ISIS ultimately was a manifestation or a symptom of a much larger problem. And that problem is that Iraq is a divided country, divided along ethnic and sectarian lines. The fact of the matter is that the Sunni Arab people of Nineveh province as a whole, and of Mosul city in particular, were not particularly hostile to ISIS when it came in 2014. On the contrary, they're very, very hostile or upset with the government in Baghdad, controlled of course by the Dawa party, a Shia Islamist party of which the current Prime Minister, Mr. Abadi, is a member. With the strong feeling the Sunnis had that was a government not committed to their welfare, not able to represent Sunnis. So from a certain point of view, they actually welcomed ISIS in. Of course, I assume they have now recovered from the sense that ISIS could represent anything positive for them. But the issue is that once ISIS is driven out, the underlying matter of Sunni-Shia division, very stark division in the country, will not go away. It will resurface. Will the Sunni Arabs of Mosul welcome the Shia-led Iraqi security forces into Mosul? Maybe they'll welcome on the day they come in. That sort of basic division in Iraq between Sunni and Shia Arabs, and then of course also with regard to the equally deep divisions between Arabs and Kurds, these are the things that are going to still be very much manifest once Mosul is taken, and it's going to manifest itself, I think, pretty soon. Who's going to control the city afterwards? What about the minority communities? What about the Shia militias? What about the Kurds? What about the areas of friction and conflict between them?
If there is a vacuum created, and you have the Kurds, the Shiite militias, the Iraqi government, the Iranians, the Syrians, the Turks, the Russians, do you see that as a potential explosive situation?
Well, yeah, I don't think the conflict is going to end in Iraq when ISIS is defeated. This is the point. ISIS is now, it's already lost around 50% of its holdings in Iraq. If and when Mosul does fall, any pretensions ISIS might have had to constituting an Islamic state in Iraq will effectively be gone. They'll be reduced to holding, some remote rural areas close to the Syrian border. But big question mark as to whether there's been sufficient reform and change in the Iraqi army since that terrible summer of 2014 when the army essentially fell apart. And my sense at least was a great deal still remains to be done, and I'm not yet convinced the Iraqi army is still a workable force. But secondly, the political side, the Kurds of course are surrounding the city to the east, north and west. And every Kurdish commander that I spoke to some of the most senior men on the lines there, want to talk about nothing other than Kurdish independence and the sense that they are no longer part of Iraq, and the way in which the fight for Mosul could be seen as a staging ground towards a Kurdish bid for independence. Of course, the Iraqi army absolutely opposed to that. Then put into the mix that the Turkish army is there close to Mosul in a place called Bashika, training a Sunni militia. Then put into the mix the fact that the Shia militias, supported by Iran, are also looking to play some kind of role in the Mosul area. So my sense is that when you look to the political level as well as the military, you discover, a very interesting and very confused and very divided reality.
And how about the Iraqi government? What's their agenda?
The Iraqi government is a Shia Islamist government, and I think that what's becoming increasingly clear is that this government is not really interested or able even to govern on behalf of all Iraqis, but rather is increasingly about building the power of the Iraqi Shia Arab majority, just to a great extent at the expense of the Sunni Arab minority and indeed of the Kurds as well. So, I would say that the Iraqi government is more and more openly looking like a sectarian government.
Are they more and more allied with Iran, or is Iran influence on them dominating?
I think Iran's very much gaining an influence. ISIS and the rise of ISIS is largely a cause for that, because when ISIS came in and Baghdad was under real threat, Ayatollah Sistani, the venerated Shia cleric in Iraq, ordered a mobilization of Shia militias to defend Baghdad. And the fact of the matter is that mobilization is now 100,000 men strong, and many different militias, but the 5 or 6 central militias in that mobilization are all linked to Iran. The sense is that the Iranians are very good at taking advantage of countries that are falling apart. They work very well in those environments. And Syria is an example of that, and Iraq also is increasingly an example of that.
Could it get even larger, this conflict?
Well, here's the thing. What you effectively have, in my view at least, is you have one conflict today which encompasses both Iraq and Syria. Effectively, those countries have collapsed and fragmented. And what you have is a kind of war over the ruins being fought out between a whole variety of different political, military forces over the ruins of those countries. So between the Iraq-Iran border and the Mediterranean Sea today, there is not any single properly functioning state, and I'd include Lebanon in that mix too. And what there is instead of that is a kind of ongoing, roiling, very difficult to resolve conflict or series of conflicts between different interests, each trying to advance their own interests over the ruins of what those countries once were.
Well, Jonathan, thank you for being with us on Jerusalem Dateline. Appreciate your insight and expertise.
You're most welcome.
Coming up, see how another major discovery confirms the Jewish connection to the city of Jerusalem, what one archaeologist calls a miracle. Welcome back. It's ironic that on the same day a United Nations group basically denied any Jewish connection to the Temple Mount behind me, a newly discovered piece of history rebuts that claim. It's a rare find and connects the Jewish people to Jerusalem as far back as 2,700 years ago. The small papyrus document contains the earliest mention of Jerusalem ever found outside of the Bible.
Prior to this, there were only 2 other papyrus written in Hebrew found from this period at all. And perhaps the greater significance is that for the first time we have in Hebrew the name Jerusalem.
Both the style of the script and the carbon-14 analysis dated the artifact back to the first Jewish temple period in the 7th century BC. It says, from the king's maidservant, from Na'arat, jars of wine, to Jerusalem.
The document is a shipment certificate from a place called Na'aran. We mention that 2 jars of wine are going to be shipped from Na'aran to Jerusalem.
A unit from the Israel Antiquities Authority seized the fragment from Palestinian looters excavating without a license.
We understood that we have something very, very important in our hand. We read it and we understood its value.
Eitan Klein said they had taken it from the same area where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found decades ago.
Until today, only in the Judean desert have scrolls been found, because the conditions in the Judean desert are probably the best for this organic materials.
Curator Panina Shore says it's not that other writings didn't exist, but these survived because of the dry climate.
This particular papyrus is actually a miracle, because here we're talking about a papyrus from First Temple times.
Scroll researcher Oren Abelman says the Jewish connection to Jerusalem is clear.
This is a period that we know from various historical accounts, both from the Bible and from external sources, that there was the kingdom of Judea at this period.
In addition to the Jerusalem connection, Shore says if the reading is correct, there's also a new understanding of the role of women.
And if it's Amat HaMelech, that's the slave, the woman officer or slave of the king. So not only are we talking about Jerusalem, we're also talking about women who are in high office.
As for the UNESCO vote, experts agreed it wasn't based on facts.
It's a political decision. It has nothing to do with reality.
It has no meaning whatsoever for archaeologists or historians.
I'm an archaeologist. I just explained in length all the reasons why this papyrus is so very important and why it is dated to the First Temple times.
Abelman said it's not only an important find for Jewish history, but also for development of the world. Up next, the battle for the Middle East in worship and prayer. Welcome back to Jerusalem Dateline. The Middle East is a region in turmoil. Just a few hundred miles from here, the Syrian civil war continues to rage. And in the campaign against ISIS in northern Iraq, it's getting more intense as Iraqi and Kurdish forces get closer to Mosul. But these military conflicts are not the only fight going on. There's also a spiritual battle contending for the fate of the Middle East. Officials expect it could take months to liberate the Iraqi city of Mosul from the grip of ISIS. While that's happening on the ground, a different campaign is taking another route. A growing prayer movement is spreading throughout the Middle East. These houses of prayer are praying for God's plan to be fulfilled in perhaps the most volatile region on earth.
So we're just seeing an increase of hours of prayer meetings, both from believers, local believers, and also people outside praying for the Middle East and coming here to pray as well.
This is the Mesopotamia House of Prayer in northern Iraq, known in the Bible as Assyria. Co-founder Fabian Gresh says they're praying for the fulfillment of Isaiah 19, which says, "In that day Israel will be one of three with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the land, whom the Lord of hosts shall bless, saying, Blessed is Egypt, my people, and Assyria the work of my hands, and Israel my inheritance."
So in order for that to happen, for Assyria, this region, the Middle East, all Muslim countries, to be a blessing on the earth, we need to become a habitation of the presence of God. And in order to be a habitation for the presence of God, God is building the altar of prayer and worship. And this is exactly what we're seeing in these prayer meetings.
With so much carnage in the region, this fulfillment might seem far-fetched. Gresh says in light of all the bad news, it's important to know where to look.
We are to look to Jesus. We are to look at God's promises in His Word, so we would be influenced by Him and not by what happens around us in this world. We easily get influenced by darkness and what happens and affects us. But if we look at Jesus and look at His Word, we see that God wants to pour out His Spirit. He's coming back for a bride, and He will have it even here in the Middle East. So we just simply need to look to Jesus, not be influenced by bad news, and hear good reports of what Jesus is doing. This way it stirs our hearts and gives us hope to believe for more.
One of the recent efforts by the Mesopotamia House of Prayer was 100 hours of continuous prayer and worship, where they hosted believers from 15 nations. In light of the turmoil going on in the Middle East, please continue to pray for the region. And as the Bible says, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Well, that's it for this edition. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.